Oh, mic check. Here we are. Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to week 5. So let me know if this is working for you. I'm pretty happy with how we're doing these asynchronous classes, but if as I've talked with a few of you, I've wondered if people are interested in doing some kind of a Zoom meet together. I don't know if that would give you more of an authentic classroom experience or just be distracting. I don't want to, be very clear. I don't want to make obligatory Zoom sessions because this is listed as an asynchronous class, so it is meant for you to be able to do all of the work of this class on your own time. But if you're looking for some human interaction, I mean, I do have 5 hours of office hours every morning from 9 to 10 a.m. And I'm available to meet with you outside, but outside of those hours. But if you're looking to, really have some kind of a classroom chat section, let me know. And I might schedule one of those probably for like a Friday or something like that. But if you're happy with how things are, let's keep a good thing going. All right, so this part of the semester is one where I tend to get bogged down in detail because I just think the ideologies of the 19th century are so fascinating. So many of you in the discussion board mentioned that you thought that technologies were more interesting than philosophies. Well, I hope to woo you over to the philosophical side of things, perhaps with today's lecture. Um, so I. I also want to remind you that I want to see a paper proposal this week, and so basically, I don't spend too much time getting bogged down in the details of the 19th century because I found that this course works better if I tilt it more towards recent history. So I'm going to try to fit a lot into this week. It's going to be a rather long lecture. But it's in. I want to do this in a way that I hope I can set up some really intelligent discussions for the weeks to come. So the thread that I want to use to tie all of this together is really a Marxist informed history of imperialism, or as Vladimir Lenin called it, the highest stage of capitalism. He actually had a little pamphlet that he wrote called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So to use that as an analytical angle, it's helpful to continue our discussion of industrialization and its discontents from last week. So here I've got just some random illustrations of industrialization. So we'll talk about Fourierism, the Fourier movement, which was popular all over the world. Basically, an idea of building socialist communes. There were many of them in New York State. I actually picked up a book recently about New York State communes that I'm looking forward to reading. This is a collective settlement in New Jersey. And then, you've also got just some absolutely amazing 18th and 19th century innovations in technology. So here, the spinning jenny is something that could do the work of 100 spinners. And obviously, that means that you've got 99 spinners who used to have gainful living from just, spinning wool or other fibers into thread, who are now put out of work. Then up here, you have a sitting Dan. That's me. So, all right. So last week, let me switch to this. Switching. Come on. Okay, so last week I accidentally gave you a bonus question on Luddism without properly explaining it. It's crazy. I did this last semester too. I'm reusing a lot of the notes from fall 2020. So, and a couple of you actually answered it, so nice work on that. It was in the reading, so I guess I don't feel too bad about it, and it was a bonus question. But I typically like the bonus questions to be drawn from whatever is in my lectures, whereas the focus questions are drawn from your readings. So, um, anyways, so one of the early responses to industrialization in both England and the young United States of America was for skilled weavers, members of guilds, to just start breaking the machines that were replacing them. So on both sides of the Atlantic, stories emerged of a mythical person named Ned Ludd. And in his honor, people literally raged against machines. So, this is industrialization absolutely changes societies. So what's one response? Try to turn the clock backward. Not particularly very effective. But it was another group of people, thinkers more than ragers, who would come to define so many of 19th century reactions to industrialization. So the early socialists and anarchists would wonder why it was that in societies filled with labor saving machines, so many people worked harder for lower wages than they did before the advent of the machines. So, if things are saving you labor, why is it that you're suddenly making less and working more hours? They're absolutely echoes of this today. We've got the amazing innovations that Amazon has created, for instance. And yet, Amazon seems to be a lightning rod for labor discontent because we have, Jeff Bezos with $100 billion and the actual workers creating this productivity who aren't making living wages. So this is a problem that has been around for 200 years with many different approaches to addressing this problem. So on the left, I've got Henri de Saint-Simon. He really interesting person. He was inspired by the American Revolution, volunteered to fight with the French forces in the United States, and absolutely enamored of everything that came out of the United States. And then, cautiously began to embrace the French Revolution. He was targeted by the terror. Once again, he embraced Napoleon as someone who was forward thinking and science oriented. And it was really in the period after Napoleon that he reached his productive zenith in his ideas. And this was the same period when, England and the United States were blossoming with industry, but France wasn't quite there yet. It would take France a few more decades to catch up with England and the United States. So Henri de Saint-Simon, he believed essentially that machines could allow for societies to be scientifically organized in a way to make sure that we could all share equally in the machine's productivity. Uh, People eventually created societies following his ideas across the world, especially in not yet industrialized parts of the world, like the Middle East and in Russia. In the middle, you've got Proudhon, who, and notice these are all French people again. Just like some of the early theorists I've looked at, something about like both the oppression and the um, intellectual ferment made it an incredibly interesting area. And, not to say that only French people had ideas in the early 19th century, but these ideas, I'm specifically focusing on the French ones because they were digested by people all over the world. So in West Africa, you had societies of Saint-Simonians. In the Middle East, you had societies of Saint-Simonians. In Qing Dynasty China, people were talking about these French ideas. Okay, so um, so Proudhon, he argued that governments were inherently exploitative, that they discouraged the free association of human beings. And he also declared that any property owned by an individual necessarily stole from the collective who should have the right to that property. So this is early anarcho-socialism. Um, he was, Karl Marx hated him as well. And then you've got Charles Fourier, who believed that Saint-Simon's dreams. So Saint-Simon, one of the things that just abhorred him about the French Revolution. I know I'm going off script here a little bit, but was the violence of it. So Henri de Saint-Simon, he believed that society should organically progress, towards more rational types of organizations. Fourier, also was like, revolutions are a little bit scary, but the best way to put into practice the ideas that Saint-Simon talked about would be to have them in small communes, which he called phalanxes, where societies could be ordered in a way to maximize the time people got to spend in play. So it's all about maximizing your playtime. And again, Fourier, super popular right here in New York State. In the 1830s and 1840s, there were societies all over the place. There was a newsletter published up in Rochester. There was a phalanx in Sodus Bay up on Lake Erie. So very, very, very close to home for us. So let's shift to Karl Marx. All right, so Karl Marx's contribution to the early socialist movement was to work to ideologically unify it. So, like so many theorists of the area, he wanted to have a theory of everything that could be scientifically applied to making or at least analyzing human progress. So, Marxism, as he envisioned it, saw the good in people and believed in human beings' abilities to become better people. Uh, building a lot on Saint-Simon. Marxism. Marx wrote a lot about Saint-Simon. So Marxism had an evolutionary component to it. Humanity started in a state of nature, much like Rousseau or John Locke envisioned it. Then they progressed into a state of barbarism, where leaders were able to siphon off excess labor. So he's always interested in surplus labor, excess labor, to get people to build things like the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Sumeria. Then people progressed into feudalism, where privileged nobles owned people's excess labor through an economic system that revolved around large agricultural manors. So, in order to make this economic system work, though, rulers always allowed merchants to congregate in cities, sort of the grease that kept the manors of feudalism working. These city dwellers, or bourgeoisie, so bourge is just a town in French, so a bourgeoisie is someone who lives in one. They were the productive force who learned to intelligently invest and use capital to maximize their returns. Capital, again, just being money. Think back to Adam Smith from last week. So eventually, they would replace feudalism with a system where noble privilege no longer mattered. Only those who had money or capital, hence capitalism. So Marx spent a lot of time praising the productive power of capitalism, along with its extractive and exploitative power. He saw it as a power that created the modern world by unifying its productive forces. But capitalism pits the bourgeoisie against the workers, what he called, using a Roman term, the proletariat. And he sort of rehabilitated the term. It was used dismissively by the Romans. It means the breeders, people who just were given an allowance of grain and wine and oil so that they wouldn't revolt. He's saying that, the revolutionary potential of the proletariat, the real workers, makes them the backbone of society and, the spark of progress. So ultimately, for Marx, the workers needed to seize control of the means of production to enter into the next phase, socialism. And eventually, the state under socialism, where workers controlled the means of production, would wither away and people would reach an anarchic stage of communism, where people would be enlightened enough to manage the economy and society without any form of oversight or coercion. It was almost a return to the state of nature, but a return to the state of nature where you had factories and modern technology and stuff. So, and in that, utopia, people would self-regulate themselves because they would all be enlightened. And he had fun writing about that. He was like, under communism, if I want to fish in the morning, rear cattle in the afternoon, and write poetry in the evening, I can do that because such will be my freedom under communism. So, for for Marx, each society had to pass through each of these evolutionary stages, and he believed in 1848 that much of the world was ready to enter the next stage of socialism. So Marx's, his scientific certainty in the way he put this theory together meant that many leaders attempting to implement communism's view of socialism in the 20th century would do pretty disgusting, horrible things for the sake of what they considered to be the greater good. And we will come back to communism quite a bit in this class, of course. So, oops. So the Communist Manifesto, though. Oops, I'll put my face over here. I'll put it off to the side. All right, so the Communist Manifesto, it came out at perhaps the most opportune time to have continent-wide and eventually global appeal. It was first published in Paris almost immediately after the overthrow of the monarchy in 1848. So on February 22nd, when the army was ordered to, and I should give you just a little bit of background. So 1815, we talked about the end of Napoleon. They had the Congress of Vienna establish a king again in France. And, that king was kind of a dunce. He was replaced by another one who everybody basically hated. And by 1848, there was just simmering discontent within France. So one of the things they did throughout the 1840s is they would have these big official banquets where everybody would get together, have fine food, and talk politics. And so on February 22nd, the army was ordered to overthrow a Parisian political banquet, and all hell broke loose as the soldiers instead joined with the revelers in protest. It was almost as if they're like, this food's too good to just, throw out. So that happened on February 22nd, 1848. On February 24th, only 2 days later, the Second Republic came into being, which, so the First Republic was the French Republic of the Revolution. The Second Republic now, after a period of monarchy in between, is declared in 1848. So France today considers its government the Fifth Republic. So, we'll get to that history in this class. So, anyways, the Second Republic came into being, which experimented with many socialist ideas, partially inspired by Marx. Eventually, an election was held later that year, and Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew, oh, I can't believe I don't have a picture of him here, who had been in exile in England, was elected as president. He had an amazing mustache. He could twirl it all out. Looks super cool. Um, if any of you guys have taken chemistry from Doug Holub, he's got the same kind of mustache. Looks just like Napoleon III. So, anyways, he was elected president, and just like his uncle, he became emperor a few years later. So, throughout his reign, he held an active assembly. So he, was more like a constitutional monarchy, and often engaged in colonialism as a way to have wars abroad that would distract people from their political differences at home. So, the French uprisings inspired what's been called a spring of nations across Europe, where people rose up demanding national rights, the rights to have their own parliaments and their own nation states. So we haven't talked about this since the second week of class, but so many people in Europe in the 19th century believed that the rights to have a constitution and a republic by definition had to be tied to your ethnic nationality. So, people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1848 were rising up saying, "No, no, no, we can't achieve our potential as a nation inside of this big ugly empire unless there's a country called Hungary for Hungarians. There's a country called, Germany for Germans. Unless there's a country called, Slavia for Slavic people." They really couldn't quite figure that one out because the Slavic people weren't quite sure if they were unified ethnically or not, at least not in 1848. They certainly figured it out later, and if you look at a map of Europe today, there are a lot of different Slavic countries. So, the same thing was happening in Italian states. So, Italy was not yet unified. There were lots of little kingdoms that where people felt like they needed to unify into a broader coalition called Italy. And Germany, also didn't exist. There were lots of different German speaking states, and many people in 1848 decided that it was time to establish a pan Prussian parliament with the goal of eventually unifying Germany, which Germany as a country would exist 22 years after this. So, not much later, not much longer later. Okay, so that spring of nations. So these uprisings, like I mentioned, they were most intense among Germans, Italians, and Slavs. The former two wanted to unify their many different states, and the latter were overwhelmingly ruled by outside powers and wanted their own national self-determination. And that's a word that would be used after World War One. So in Austria-Hungary, the revolutions of 1848 did lead to greater autonomy for Hungarians. In fact, it was just called the Habsburg Empire, but by 1867, they officially changed the name from the Habsburg Empire to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which made the Hungarians happy but kind of pissed off all the Slavs who were like, why isn't it called the Austro-Hungarian Slavic Empire? Um, So this led to greater autonomy for the Hungarians and perpetual promises to give something to the many different Slavs inside the empire. So in Prussia, a pan-German parliament was established that would eventually succeed in unifying many parts of the German-speaking areas into a German empire. So I'm talking a lot, probably boring you. Let's look at a map. So this is a visual. So in 1848, February 22nd, you have an uprising in Paris. and then suddenly, bam, 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 all over Europe, inside the Ottoman Empire region. Irish people, you remember, are still in the midst of the horrific famine. So all of these people are rising up in this major year of revolutions. Okay, so I want to shift now. I want to shift to the colonial world. And this is going to be a key part of this class. And I want to look at both the colonial metropoles or home countries and colonial peripheries or colonies. And I want to start with Algeria and the weird story of how Algeria became a French colony. And we're going to come back to Algeria later in the semester too, as its resistant movement would become an inspiration to the rest of the colonial world. So Algiers, along with Tripoli, Tunis, and some Moroccan cities, made up what Europeans called the Barbary states. Uh, and Barbary, it comes from the term Berber, which is an ethnic group in North Africa. Uh, but for centuries, these states had basically run a protection racket in the Mediterranean Sea with varying degrees of success. So they were city states that were nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. Algiers, in particular, had been hurting since the early part of the 19th century when U.S. Marines attacked Algiers to free imprisoned U.S. sailors. The United States, the young United States of America, was like, screw that, we're not paying protection money. And so that was like the first overseas military attack by the United States of America. And that's why in the Marine song, it says, from the halls of Montezuma, referring to the Spanish Mexican American War, to the shores of Tripoli. That's referring to this very early 19th century engagement. So the U.S. had been to Algiers, and they kind of devastated the place to free U.S. sailors. And so in 1830, they were hurting. And so in 1830, the Dey of Algiers, the ruler of the city-state, was doing whatever he could to get money. And he met with a French diplomat and reminded him that Napoleon's government had never paid back the government of Algiers for loaning his troops wheat when they invaded Egypt. This is way back in 1797. So he's basically saying, hey, we got a 33-year-old debt. You going to pay? The French diplomat refused to pay. He was like, that was a different government. That is not my government. And so in the ensuing argument, the Dey of Algiers, he picked up a fly swatter, which, in this period of they used horsetails to swat flies. So he picked up a horsetail and whipped him across the face with it. So the French diplomat, he left in a huff, and over the next few days, the fly swatter incident was whipped up in the French press as an example of Algiers' insolence, and this, so it's not funny anymore. So this incident was used to justify an invasion, not just of Algiers, but of vast hinterland to the south of the city. So in 1848, the same general who had led the invasion of what became Algeria, so this happened in 1830. So now fast forward to 1848. So in 1830, France conquered Algeria. By 1848, the year they have the revolution, Louis Cavaignac was briefly dictator of the new republic, and he officially annexed Algeria formally into France. So Algeria is no longer a colony, it's part of France. Between 1848 and 1962, any map of France included Algeria as part of France, and then, the vast French colonial empire. Um, annexing places in 1848, that's kind of a popular thing to do. That was the same year that the United States annexed most of northern Mexico. So the American Southwest used to be, the Mexican North. But in 1848, that's when the United States, basically became an empire. So over the next century, French, Italian, and Spanish settlers flooded into Algeria, calling themselves Blackfeet or Pied Noirs. So I'm taking French right now here at SUNY Delhi. I don't know if I pronounce pied. I think it's just pied noir, pied noir. Okay, so over the course of the 19th century, locals were dispossessed of their land, usually using the pretext of them not having written title to the land, and robbed of the rights of French citizenship. So locals were treated as conquered people, very much like Native Americans were in the American West. This is happening at the exact same period in time. So, in order to become French citizens, locals needed to renounce Islam, which most were unwilling to do. Those who were willing to renounce Islam were usually not believed by local clerks, who made it so that by the year 1954, Europeans numbered 1 million and were all citizens. While Algerians, so native Algerians, numbered 4 million people in the colony, and only 4,000 of them had citizenship. So Algeria is a classic example of a settler colony. It was modeled in many ways on what was simultaneously happening on a much larger scale in the American West and other places like South Africa, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. So while Algerians' lives were becoming increasingly worse. Okay, good. Oh, I'm so glad I did remember to put a picture of Napoleon III in. Look at that mustache. Whew, amazing mustache. All right, so while Algerians' lives were becoming increasingly worse, French people were living in a time of abundance. By the end of their revolution of 1848, Napoleon's nephew, returned from exile in England and was appointed emperor once again. French people really seemed to like having a democracy with an emperor at its head. That's what they did under Napoleon the First, too. So Napoleon was convinced that France needed to adopt the policies of England to remain competitive in the world. English democracy, however limited, gave them more power as it empowered more people to participate in the life of the country. It also allowed for a flourishing of industrialization, which he desperately wanted in France too. So over his 22-year reign, Napoleon III waffled between being an autocrat and a democrat. French people gained universal male suffrage under him. While in exile in England, he witnessed and became fascinated with the Industrial Revolution and wanted to bring that to France. Socialists also wanted industrialization, so he worked together with them creating crédits mobiliers, or micro investment credit unions, where ordinary people could invest in and reap benefits from the industrialization of their country. So, what I want to show in the next few slides, though, is that he felt that the best way to unify the country whenever things got dicey in domestic policies was to go invade somewhere and get another colony. So, this is where things are getting really messed up. So, at the same time that the French were expanding their colonies, so too did the British, then Germans, then Belgians, joining earlier Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish colonial holdings that would later be followed by Japan, Russia, and the United States of America. So, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, in 1916, Lenin would write that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, as a criticism of the massive capitalist economies of the world that have carved up so much of the world for no other reason than wanting their resources. What went hand in hand with this exploitation was justification. These people were supposedly uncivilized, therefore, they were undeserving of their own resources and in need of European or Japanese guidance, or United States guidance. It was all a whole bunch of nonsense. So Gonick also spends a few pages dealing with the Ottoman Empire. Like I said, we're dealing with a lot this week, but you can do it. So the 19th century was a period of decline for the Ottomans. Remember, they used to be an empire. Empire was right in their name. But while other Europeans were increasing their empires, the Ottomans were on the retreat. So the 19th century was a period of decline as areas along their border revolted and then became subservient to control by European capital. So the Ottomans weren't passive to the loss of empire along their borders. Many realized that they needed to change. It was just hard to fight against a centuries old entrenched culture of regional privilege. So they still tried. And one way they focused on doing this was creating the semblance of a modern state, especially in cities like Constantinople, later known as Istanbul, which they reworked to have straight streets, sidewalks, gas streetlights, public transportation, running water, sewer systems, indoor plumbing, and eventually electricity. So the policies of Tanzimat, that's their term for reform, from 1839 to 1876 attempted to create things like uniform tax policies, uniform military policies, national markers like a flag and anthem, which is just funny. It's like every country needs a national anthem, right? The Ottoman Empire didn't have one for 500 years. Um, their national anthem actually didn't have words because there were so many dozens of languages spoken in their vast empire that they were like, it's too hard. So I guess you just kind of hum along to their national anthem. One of their policies that often backfired was trying to eliminate differences between Christians and Muslims. The Ottoman Empire, even though it was identified as Islamic, the majority of its people were always Christians until the very end of the empire. So, for centuries in places like Lebanon, for example, French traders asked the Ottomans to give preferential treatment, or bagats, permissions to trade without tax, to Christians. The Ottomans agreed for the economic stimulus it brought, but Muslims were obviously resentful that they still had to pay taxes. So when Christians in the 1860s resisted efforts to be required to serve in the military, their Muslim neighbors turned on them in the 1860s, conducting anti Christian pogroms, mass killings. According to lower estimates, thousands of Christians were killed. According to higher estimates, tens of thousands. So these pogroms were used as a pretext for greater French control over Lebanon and Syria, and eventually they would annex these as mandate colonies after World War One. So, as the Ottomans in particular began to negotiate with the modern world, many Islamic thinkers, as well as political thinkers, and we haven't talked a lot about the Middle East or Islamic world yet in this class. So let's jump in a little bit, and remember that so much of this is happening at the same time as like the Don Fodio revolt in West Africa that we did talk about earlier. So many people began to use Islam as a way to think about the modern world. So one of the important axes for Muslims that has its parallels across the world is that between those who wanted to embrace the future and progress as good things and those who wanted to reject it and look back to more of an idealized past. So Salafis looked and still look, I mean, they're still around today, of course, to the early days of Islam for inspiration. They reasoned that in the 600s, Muslims were spreading across the earth and with great power, while in the 1800s, they were relatively weak and poor. So it must be that they were better at living their religion in the 600s, so needed to change by looking backwards. Ichihadis, by contrast, they wanted to adopt technology and new political ideas to Islam, recognizing that change, progress, and science could benefit faith as well. So I want to give a specific example. So an earlier movement with a lot, okay, sorry, an earlier movement that parallels many of the ideas of the Salafis was the Wahhabi movement of Arabia, which is briefly mentioned by Ganek. I should point out that all of these ideas, they're around today. In Egypt, for example, Ichihadi is often used as a way to call someone a nerd. Well, Salafis, a nerd because they like to study. Well, Salafis advocate conservative interpretations of Islam across the world, and Wahhabism is the official interpretation of Islam in Saudi Arabia. That's why I have the Saudi Arabian flag here, as well as a few of the Gulf states. So Wahhabism was older than the Salafi movement, though, and emerged from the teachings of a person named Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab in the early 1700s. So the movement gained power 100 years later when the House of Saud used his teachings. They were a group in Arabia to resist who they considered to be the godless Ottoman authorities and eventually lay claim to the holiest sites of Islam. So I point to some other global religious movements in this slide as well, uh, that were also focused on things like the end of days. Such millenarian religious movements proliferated in an era of unprecedented social and industrial change. So after World War One, the House of Saud would lay claim to much of Arabia and created the country of Saudi Arabia, which is still ruled by the Saud family today. So I want to shift gears now. Take a break if you need to. This is a lot. Oops. Let's just move my face to the side. All right, I want to shift gears and consider the Crimean War. And I want to do it through the lens of modernization and want to argue that this war showed virtually everyone involved that they needed to change how they did things. So the Crimean War was by far the bloodiest European conflict of the 19th century. Roughly 1 million people died, largely from diseases like cholera, that could have been mitigated through simple sanitation, like having proper toilets or latrines. The war itself, however, was absolutely nonsensical. It began as a conflict between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The Russians had been expanding against the Ottomans for more than a century, using the justification that they had a duty to expand as the protectors of Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands. So in 1853, Tsar Nicholas I threatened war if he couldn't be made the official protector of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans refused, knowing that the British and French would aid them in order to not let the Russians get too powerful, and because that's kind of a weird demand. So once war began, in early battles, the Russians seemed to be overpowering the Ottomans. The British worried that this would upset the balance of power in Europe. I want to let that sink in. The British went to war not for ideological, moral, or humanitarian justifications, which are often nonsense to begin with. They went to war to maintain a balance of power. The French got involved largely for the sake of prestige, and the Sardinians, a region in Italy today, got involved with a promise from the French that they wouldn't oppose Sardinian efforts to unify Italy, like they did in 1849 when the Italians were revolting. In the slide I mentioned earlier, the French sent in troops to overthrow an attempt at unifying Italy. Again, worried about maintaining a balance of power. Don't let anyone get too powerful. So the Italians went to war for the sake of domestic politics, the French went to war to look good, and the British went to war for a nonsense reason. And frankly, so did the Russians. You know, it was really the Ottomans defending their territory. The war was a disaster for everyone involved. Most who died wouldn't have died had there just been proper sanitation. So, and I've got some, details about this here that I'm not going to go over. But one of the lessons learned by Nicholas I, his successor at least, as Russian Tsar Alexander II, was that Russia lost the war because of their horrible underdevelopment. Russia had no railroads. It took them 3 months to resupply troops fighting in their own empire, while the British and French were able to resupply troops in just a week, coming by sea from across the continent using steamships. So during his reign, Alexander II tried to remedy this underdevelopment by engaging in comprehensive changes. And I want you to think in your mind of how these reforms are similar to the French and the Ottomans. Remember, everybody is trying to modernize in this period. That's another one of the themes. Imperialism and modernization are the two things I want you to keep in the front of your mind as we're talking about this period. So, he engaged in what were called the Great Reforms, which mimicked much of what was happening in the Middle East and really around the world in this period. So they focused on the usual subjects such as trying to promote better infrastructure, building railroads, telegraph lines, and they promoted the building of factories. They of course worked to modernize the military, but they also wanted to transform Russian society. In 1861, Russians abolished serfdom. 80% of Russians were still serfs before this decree, which predated the Emancipation Proclamation in the US by 2 years. Serfs weren't the same as African descended slaves in the Western Hemisphere. They had legal rights. They could even take their masters to court, but they could be bought and sold. Families could be split up, and they were not allowed to leave their estates without permission unless they could make it to the frontier regions and join a Cossack regiment. So once in the frontier, they were free, at least traditionally, provided they could be called upon as a cavalry service in time of war. But recognizing the value of freedom to building free markets, the Russians decided to give freedom a try. So over the next decades, Russia prospered as a free economy came into existence, as old restrictions on Jewish life were abandoned, and as literacy blossomed among what was one of the most illiterate empires on earth. But radicalism also flourished, both on the extreme right, as evidenced through frequent anti Semitic pogroms and radical nationalism, and on the extreme left, which would culminate with the revolutions of 1905 and 1917. But for a few decades, Russians modernized much the same way as everyone else in the world was doing. So in this slide, I've got a Nick Carter detective novel, which was one of the favorites among the newly literate Russian masses, who, much to the chagrin of the nobility, preferred cheap, thrilling dime novels to the proper literature of Russia, such as Pushkin or Dostoevsky or even the Bible. So again, with literacy comes so much progress and opportunity. So another symbol of the era of embracing the new and efficient at the expense of the old, historic and cultural, was the policies of the Baron Georges Haussmann. So now we're jumping to Paris. So Haussmann was given imperial permission to redesign Paris during the 1850s. So, like any efficiency minded person, he decided wide, straight boulevards were preferable to the narrow medieval streets of the ancient capital. To build them along with modern plumbing and sewers, he worked with the army to destroy huge swaths of Paris. The picture on the bottom right shows his master plan to have the Arc de Triomphe at the center of the city with large boulevards radiating out like wheels. Paris was to be a modern capital of global finance, not an ancient city where narrow avenues made it easy to perpetually revolt and throw up barricades. So some have compared Haussmann to Faust, who I talked about earlier, arguing that his reforms were Faustian bargains. We talked about this last week. So after the Crimean War, perhaps, and again, just I'm going through a lot this week because I want to not spend as much time on it as I traditionally have in past semesters, with the hope that we can spend a lot more time on the 20th century. So everything I'm talking about is background to help you make sense of the 20th century. But if there's anything that you're looking at that you would like to go into in more depth, oh my gosh, what a wonderful paper idea. And please, I'm happy to talk with you about sources, ideas, theses, whatever. Okay, so and I've talked with you already, a few of you already about your theses for the paper. So I think we've got a smart class here. You do good job, good work on your focus questions. All right. So after the Crimean War, perhaps the defining conflict for Western Europeans, at least on their own continent, before World War I, would be the Franco-Prussian War. I've outlined some causes of the war on this slide, but suffice it to say, they're nonsense. The real, and this slide, okay, it wasn't fought in Africa. I just wanted to point out that, the logic of the war was very much the logic of a game of Risk. If you think you can one up your neighbor with a stupid attack, you go ahead and do it. I should probably change those Risk pieces to actually be on Europe. But anyways, the real cause of the war was nationalism. The Prussians didn't go to war to help ensure that the rightful Habsburg heir sat on the throne of Spain. They didn't care. They went to war because they wanted to have the power to unify the German-speaking areas of Central Europe into the German Empire. Otto von Bismarck would unify Germany during this conflict and feared that the French would oppose his efforts. So, after a leaked document purported to show French and Prussian diplomats insulting each other's countries, majorities within both France and Prussia supported war. Your reading for this week spends a bit of space on Bismarck. I wanted to make sure you have a broad overview of what he was like. So, Bismarck became infamous in the 1860s as Prussia's foreign minister when he advocated a foreign policy known as Realpolitik, which meant roughly that the ends justify the means, or that it's okay to behave reprehensibly if it benefits your country, the state. So, in conflicts with Austria, he first allied himself with the Danes before turning against them because he could, and Prussia would grow because of it. He was also a shrewd political deal maker. Once he was Chancellor of the German Empire, that he did things that were remarkably progressive, like create a health insurance system and social security, not because he cared for the policies, but because he wanted to undermine support for socialists who he hated. So he gave them what they wanted. So, one of Bismarck's policies that would become incredibly important to world history was his seizure of colonies in Africa. Just like Napoleon III had sought them for prestige, so too did he hope to show that Germany was a world class power. So it was Bismarck who called together the infamous Berlin Conference over December and January of 1884 and 1885, where European powers agreed to divide up almost all of Africa amongst themselves. The book cover I have here argues that women's rights groups in Germany were often co opted in the service of nationalism and empire. Learning to do things like shooting was considered an important skill to make Germany great. The mass murder of the Herero in what is today Namibia by German imperial forces could be considered the first genocide of the 20th century, too. German Cameroon, which was shoddily divided between the British and French after World War I, is actually the site of an ongoing horrible conflict right now as I'm speaking, where the French part of the country is carrying out scorched earth campaigns to root out rebels in the English speaking part of the country, what they call the Anglophone or Southwest Cameroon. So, shortly after the Crimean War in 1860, Camillo Benso di Cavour, Prime Minister of Sardinia and Piedmont, would unify Italy. One of his strategies, which has since been called the Piedmont Principle, was to make the north of Italy so successful through building infrastructure, railroads, and pro business policies that encouraged industrialization that the rest of the Italian states would want to join with them. So he was also the first prime minister of Italy. Only a few years after joining Italy, many new Italians began to feel buyer's remorse. Especially in the South, it seemed that this new government was all for exploitation without promised development. Italians rejected the secularism of the North um, as well, and formed governments through coercion and bribery, what they called transformismos, that brought together the political right and left, masking the extremes that had developed in their country. So Italians would have another one of the largest communist parties in Europe, as well as become the first country to openly embrace and really define fascism in the 20th century. So the weakness of the government meant that for many, crime was really the only way to get things done all over the country. In the South, the mafia filled the void of largely ineffective governments, leading many Italians, especially Sicilians, to just leave as immigrants to the rest of the world. Italy's loss was, of course, the United States of America's gain, as many who left in this period established vibrant, successful communities here in our country. But they also went to other places. They went to Algeria, they went all over South America. So, this is the reason why so many Italians were on the move in the 19th century. All right, this week's presentation is already longer than usual, but like I said earlier, I'm really trying to lay some groundwork to spring into a deep discussion of the 20th century for the remainder of the semester. So we've dealt, and again, Gonic's all over the place. I just want to give you some context. So we've dealt with a few examples of modernity, or the act of modernizing so far. The gold standard that we looked at last week was England. The United States was also on the cutting edge in this early period. French leaders, especially Napoleon III, tried to play catch up with England, and in so doing, set a precedent for the horrifying exploitation of eventually almost the entire global South. That exploitation, as part of a recognizable system, was theorized by Karl Marx, who had the goal to unify the wide ranging socialist movements of his day. By the end of the 19th century, then, old empires like Russia and the Ottomans realized the need to modernize themselves. Another kingdom that had remained isolated from the rest of the world for centuries, Japan, we talked about this history a couple weeks ago, underwent something called the Meiji Restoration after their forced opening to the rest of the world by American gunboats in 1852. The Meiji restored a unified Japanese empire and to strengthen Japan, copied policies of Prussia, England, and the United States of America as they worked to build factories, modernize their military, and by 1895 exert imperialist control over Korea, then parts of China, eventually leading to their 1930s era expansions that would cause the Pacific theater of the Second World War, where most of the horrifying fighting occurred in China. So, as I've been dealing with the policies and procedures of modernization in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, one real world effect of modernization was that in the desire to create nation states or nations uh, or states unified by ethnicity, race, religion, and language, there were always those people who were imagined by nationalists as not belonging. One diaspora group that had an especially difficult time in the 19th century were European Jews. Your reading deals with the case of the Dreyfus Affair, where a French artillery officer was accused of selling French secrets to the Germans. This false claim was supported by the fact that this officer was Jewish, and in the minds of French nationalists, therefore not worthy of French citizenship. We hear this kind of nonsense in our country today with attacks on Muslim members of Congress like Ilana Omar or Rashida Tlaib that they somehow must be trying to undermine America because of their background. The charges were false then and they're false now, but he was guilty in the realm of French public opinion. This case in particular motivated a Hungarian Jewish person, Theodor Herzl, to coin the term Zionism. arguing that Jewish people would never belong in Europe or anywhere else, that they needed to reclaim their ancestral homeland of Israel, that that's the only place they could belong. So at first, a handful of German, Hungarian, English, French, and Russian Jews attempted to settle in Ottoman Palestine. Their Arab neighbors mostly regarded them as a curiosity, but generally got along just fine with them. There were already large numbers of Jewish people in Palestine, as there were Christians and Muslims. But by the 1930s, extreme nationalism among some Arabs and some Jewish emigres led to violence that would later explode into war when Israel declared independence in 1948. Zionism would offer hope to those escaping the horrors of the Holocaust, but terror to those who fled their homes in 1948 with the establishment of Israel, the Nakba of the Palestinians. So while Israel has offered full civil rights to its large non Jewish minority, in practice there remains intense discrimination against Arab Israelis or Palestinians, and many feel like their full rights are in fact second class citizenship rights. So we'll come back to Israel and Palestine later in the semester. All right, that's a ton. Wow, what a lot. I hope you have a good basis to engage with your focus questions. I hope you have fun with your focus questions. And good luck now with these bonus questions. And seriously, phew. Oh, whoops! I meant to have another Zionism slide. So here's an early kibbutz, and this is Zionist propaganda from the late 19th century. All right, have a few bonus questions, and I'll talk with you all about anything you'd like to talk about. Good luck thinking through your papers as well. All right, good luck. Have an awesome week 5.